by Simons and Shibley. Okay. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about a program that I'm currently running at Washington University in St. Louis. And it's an unusual project in that the funding for this initiative came from a very unusual source. I know that when we're usually applying to put together centers or fellows programs, we're usually applying for arts money. I was approached by our Scandalera Center for Entrepreneurship to put together an application for a significant, $25,000 grant to bring together people from the arts and the sciences. It was actually really that simple. And the Scandalera Center typically funds people who want to launch small businesses or small projects. What's unique about this project is that I managed to convince the Scandalera Center for Entrepreneurship, which is based in our business school, that the bringing together of people to share ideas was an entrepreneurial project, and that the outcome, the thoughts and the conversations themselves, would be an entrepreneurial outcome. And they completely bought into this, and I got funding to bring together people from psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, biology, neuroscience, architecture, the humanities, Romance languages, and philosophy to meet, to share research. And the culmination of these meetings over the last year resulted in a 2-day symposium at UCLA that I co-organized with the head of the California Nanosystems Institute, Victoria Vesna, where I flew 5 of my fellows out, and we combined, we looked at art and the brain. She combined some of her fellows with my fellows, and we had a terrific 2-day symposium. So something to think about as you're looking at ways to bring these kinds of conversations together, is that it can sometimes be a most unexpected source that ends up funding these terrific initiatives. So these are some of the meetings. Ron Lex and this gentleman here is from sculpture. Lizzie Schechter is a neuroscientist. There I am. And Victoria Vesna from UCLA. We're all meeting over wine and cheese. We call the after 3 drinks, no more disciplines exist. So this is what UCLA holds these monthly mixers between artists and scientists, and they've been really successful. This is the California Nanosystems Institute. So Art in the Brain, Stories and Structures was a symposium that we again just co-hosted a couple of weeks ago. This was the poster for that, Art in the Brain. And the program kicked off with a wonderful talk by Larry Snyder, who is a neuroscientist who often works with macaque monkeys, and he's working on mirror neurons and working with perception, with primate perception, the idea being that the same mirror neurons that these macaque monkeys have are the same mirror neurons that we have. But his talk was incredibly inspiring. What he said, behind good science is a good story. And his background is also in literature. So the way that he teaches his students is to say, where's the story in the science that you're actually pursuing, right? Find the story. So you can see he was using some very unconventional slides and methods, but proof to say, science isn't this dry area, that people are deeply synthetic in the way that they think about advancing their research. And so these were some of the neuro stories, images that he was showing. Here he's got the monkey in the forest with a book of poetry trying to decide, because he's always putting these test subjects in situations where they have to, again, the brain has to choose, right? So he had us playing with the Pinocchio illusion, and this might be kind of a fun thing for you to do in your spare time. Put a chair with a friend in front, touch your own nose, get your fingers circling the end of the nose in the same direction that you circle your friend's nose, and within about 30 seconds, it's impossible to distinguish the difference between your nose and their nose. And this is called the Pinocchio effect. You really feel as though your nose is about 4.5, 5 feet away from your face, depending on how long your arms are. So we were really creasing up laughing over this. It was great fun, but try it. It's a good experiment. Rebecca Messbarger wrote the first book on Anna Morandi, the first female anatomist, and she was supported in her time by Pope Benedict, who was a big supporter of art and science coming together. And so if you want to look up the sort of the history of anatomy and Anna Morandi, Rebecca Misbarger is the person who wrote the biography of Anna Morandi. Ron Lex had a background in science and runs his own studio like a laboratory of sorts. You might want to look him up. And Sung-Ho Kim is my collaborator. I'll show you my next project. And Sung-Ho produced the CNC routed video tiles for that piece. Sung-Ho did an amazing talk. Sung-Ho did his PhD at MIT, and he did a lecture on the kind of analogies between Godzilla as a monster and the kind of architectural monsters. He works extensively with skinning things. I don't mean taxidermy, I mean he began by showing us the way that different textures come together in these kind of great scientific displays, and the way that he brings that kind of idea into his practice as an architect is to think about the external and even the interior walls of a space as kind of living skin. So, so we're constantly working together. This is not a joint project here. This is his work on surface. He's working with engineering a lot to create these living walls, these living moss walls, and these are the armatures that he's building to create these moss walls. So the idea being that the entire wall of an interior would be covered with this living moss. So of course they have to have these self-watering systems, and they're very complex, but he is a very complex thinker, and I'm very fortunate to have him as a periodic collaborator on my work. I wanted to just show you this slide because Jim Jimjowski is the head of the Nanosystems Institute at UCLA, and he works extensively with art. And his lecture at this Art Brain Symposium talked about the ubiquity of complex systems. But if you look at the examples that he's showing, from global internet activity to modern banking, to the airline system, to biological systems, you can see that there are certain people whose orientation and thinking are inherently open to collaboration. And this is our chair of biology, who talked extensively about new imaging methods and how these are transformative for the ways that science actually advances. So here we were at the Sewell Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. This is Dr. Mark Cohen with probably the most expensive MRI machine in the country. And he also runs these hydrogel geodesic sensor nets, which are often great fashion devices. I thought the kind of fembot look was amazing. But he does a lot of testing of brain activity. And, you know, again, it's interesting to see how these different areas at UCLA are dovetailing together to create this kind of third culture. So from this kind of brain mapping, Victoria and Mark got together to create this octopus. I'm not sure what this piece is called, but there were devices in these octopus hoods that this piece riffs a little bit off Marina Abramovich's piece, and also Suzanne Dicker and Matthias Oostrich's piece about kind of coming into sync with one another. So depending on how, you know, she wouldn't tell us exactly how these measuring systems were working, but if people would sit long enough, their colors would eventually correlate. So, and people had great fun with this as well. So the last piece I'll talk about today is a piece called Dark Skies. This is a collaboration with Chris Ottinger. And it was beautifully documented by someone I'm working with now, Adam Hogan, who's a brilliant videographer. But this is New York City along Central Park. And you may be aware that photopollution or luminous pollution is the excessive or obtrusive artificial light that is defined by the International Dark Sky Association as any adverse effect of artificial light, including sky glow, glare, light trespass, light clutter, decreased visibility and energy waste. So this is how the Dark Sky Society sort of kind of conceptualizes and defines light pollution. And adverse consequences are multiple. Many of them aren't even known yet. So what you see on the left is the night sky, and what you see on the right is the night sky without the blackout, essentially. So you can see how much more is visible with the night sky. And apparently when there was a major blackout a number of years ago in Los Angeles, the emergency lines were completely overloaded with people calling in and saying that there was a strange silvery light in the sky. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of calls, and that silvery light was the Milky Way. But we're not used to seeing it, right? So I became interested in light pollution not in and of itself. I'm interested in what it does to human consciousness, that if we actually live on a planet, right, where we can no longer observe the universe, what does that do to human consciousness? What does that do to our sense of self? So I'm more interested in the larger sort of implications. Here you've got a map of the world. You can see where the largest clusters of light are. You can see that, of course, if you go to Antarctica, you probably have, well, you do have the best observatories in the world for seeing the night sky and all that ozone that's not there anymore. And what's interesting, if you also layer a map of significant diseases such as cancer, they align with this. So the areas where you have the highest concentration of light, you also have the highest incidence of cancer. It could be from the light, it could be from other things creating the light, or the situations of urban development. But that correlation is very, very much there. And of course, what it does to our little nocturnal friends, right? You know about good sleep hygiene, dark room, small dark room, completely blocking light, right? This is what my good German doctor says is good sleep hygiene, he says, right? So the circadian rhythms of the body need darkness, actually need darkness. So jumping back to a show that I had at the National Academy of Sciences, I got a great Office of the Vice President for Research grant here a number of years ago to work with people in the human genetics department and also the laboratories that had the scanning electron microscopes. And I began imaging sites of sensation on the body, inner ear cochlea, human eye tissue, nasal epithelial cells, taste buds. This is a taste bud. And Sung Ho and I then got together and through the different software programs that he's got in his architectural firm, we worked together, though it was his technicians that really worked on abstracting these forms and figuring out how much relief we could get away with in CNC routing 2 tiles that would be used for video projection. So this is how it started. We started playing with these different diagrams of projection systems and what that would do to the human presence in a room. So you can see different shadow configurations here. You can see the height of the different peaks that we were playing with. And this is the CNC router at Washington University. I think your fab labs here are probably much larger than ours, but this is the largest form that our CNC router had ever routed. It's 4 by 8 feet. I routed 2 of them. I think they each took, we really used the minimal amount of surface detail. And each one took 25 hours. So put together, it's an 8 by 8 foot digital projection. And this is what the surface looks like. So this is the abstracted surface of that taste bud that you see. And again, I was sort of mildly inspired by Paul Baccarita's work in attaching sensors to people's tongues. There's an apparatus that blind people can actually wear where the vibration of what you would see has been transferred to the tongue. So blind people can literally, with this apparatus, move through a room and see the room through the tongue. So this kind of sensory displacement or stand-in, sensory stand-in was very interesting to me as well. And this is a still from that. And what you're seeing here, let me explain this. There are 2 videos, one of a crepuscular sky and one of a dark sky with a kind of Milky Way going through it. And these are hitting this dimensional video surface at raking angles from the left and the right. And there's also a soundtrack that comes out of two separate speakers. The idea being that the more you move to the left, you see one sky, the more you move to the right, you see the other sky. So here you see the surface of the tiles from the left and then from the right. So you see something quite different. And if you stand in the middle, you just have a kind of lenticular effect to this work. So let's see if I can get the video to work here. Okay, so that's the piece. It was shown in a kind of project space at UCLA a couple of years ago, so we're looking to expand this now. And the sound comes from raw files sound files that I took when I was an artist in residence at the Banff Center for the Arts of these twilight creatures. So you've got insects and birds and all sorts of whatever else is running around in the mountains at night. Yeti, maybe, Sasquatch, maybe. And I worked with Chris Ottinger, and I gave him these sound files, and he knew my other work, so we were able to work really well together. But he's a really brilliant sound designer, so let me just read to you his idea about this sound design that he did post-production on. So the sound design in Dark Skies serves two functions. The first is to sonically articulate the ambiguous space between micro and macro environments, echoing those depicted in video elements. The second was to add an interactive and immersive quality to the work. To accomplish the first task, I studied Patricia's field recordings intently, searching for small sounds that could be enlarged, and large sounds that could inhabit a dark sky. These sounds were subsequently edited, sped up, slowed down, and filtered to locate hidden tones, noises, and frequencies within the source audio. The final result is a soundscape that exists somewhere between conventional sound design and a musical score. Each of the two tracks in Dark Skies possesses their own unique characteristics. One emphasizes lower frequencies, deep rumbling sounds that are intended to shrink the listener down to the level of the microscopic. The other presents the listener with an expansive sonic landscape that morphs from flourishes of birds to industrial machinery to spooky moans in the distance. The second soundtrack can be described in terms of a macro view or a zooming out from the world of the microscopic. For the interactive component, the sound elements will be projected directionally onto the exhibition space, and viewers will be able to migrate between these two soundtracks, essentially moving between micro and macro worlds. So again, the piece goes after a certain amount of affect, right? So In summary, I would say these are a series of examples of people who are, again, plugging into that spectrum of the kind of art science connected landscape, right? And that there's no one single way to do it. That in some cases people are inspired and the work resides very concretely in a more kind of space of poetics. In other cases, as I say, in the case of Ellen Levy, who collaborates with neuroscientist Mickey Goldberg at Columbia University, she's working very closely with him to fully understand the neuroscience so she can replicate the actual experiments in her work. So I hope this was informative, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Thanks, Gunnar. Thanks, Alona. Oh, he's not letting you leave. Great. Good, good, good. Right. Terrific. Oh, there you are. I could see you. My eyes had adjusted. Good. So any questions, comments, thoughts, answers? I have lots of questions always about this stuff, but it's a lot I threw at you, I know. A lot of stuff. Yes?
Have you ever experienced that artistic curiosity has led to a new approach in science directly?
Mm-hmm. I use you as the example of someone who's actually done that.
Okay.
Yes, I think it's rare. I think this is always the question, that artists will have, in some cases, been kind of interlopers into the field of science. If those ideas from science are misrepresented or they don't incite reasoned debate about a controversial issue, then it's a bad, bad, bad thing. And scientists are understandably very frustrated with these kinds of collaborations. On the other hand, artists are often contacted by scientists to visualize, right? We become the illustrators of a particular project, right? And I think artists then get their knickers in a twist about that. But I do think it sometimes happens. I use you as the example in part because, if I'm recalling correctly, your interpretation of the mathematics behind the subatomic particles led to new interpretations of what those things could look like that some of the scientists hadn't thought of, but the math was right. So I would say that probably Ellen's, I'm not sure if Mickey would say that Ellen had changed the trajectory of the actual scientific experiment, but I think it changes the way that people actually understand the human dimension of science. And I also think that artists create a kind of bridge between science and the lay audience. And that might be the most significant contribution that artists have to the art-science collaborations. But I think in a rare case that artists can take and understand the information, reinterpret it, and give it back to the scientist in a way that is factually and scientifically accurate, but that might not be the kind of interpretation that is coming out of a particular lab for whatever sets of reasons. Yeah. But that is the challenge. Yeah, that is the challenge.
It is a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it happens by coincidence.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would venture a guess that perhaps the most successful collaborations are where there isn't necessarily a specific outcome. It's not outcome driven. It's that two people are really talking to each other in ways that are truly generative, where there's this emergent quality, and maybe 5 years later something happens, and maybe it doesn't. But the conversations continue because of interest. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my second question.
Mm-hmm.
And to what extent are you aware of how art and science collaborations has been documented as a process, not as a visual or physical result,
Mm-hmm.
but rather as a dialogue, and how those dialogues, because I think that's the lack of documentation of the scientific and the visually creative or physically creative process how they have been, how they can be collected.
Yeah. Excellent and astute point. And I would pull back from that, and I would say it's also the problem that we as artists have.
Right.
We as artists don't do a good job of documenting what we do or coming up with our own value proposition for what it is that we do. We don't understand generally how to talk about what it is that we do in practice, right? The research institution knows how to frame scholarship, but what to do with practice is much more complicated. And so, yeah, this is part of that problem as well, is the lack of documentation. Although I would say certain programs where there have been artists in residencies have documented some of these processes. So the Artists in Residence program at NASA, I think probably, I mean, I've met people from there who can walk you through the problem, so they've been paying attention. There's a new grant that takes artists to the Antarctic. What are the dangers of that in terms of the kind of footprint that we leave in the Antarctic, and what the footprint of that is. And then how people reside in the station down there, the biostation down there, I think is probably being documented. But there are a lot of different, I was talking about this with Lori from A2RU, the director of A2RU this afternoon, that there are a lot of different groups who are interested in these kinds of dialogues and the documentation of the processes, but they're not kind of coalescing into one space yet. So I think A2RU could be one place that could be the repository for those stories. Roger Molina at the University of Dallas, he's an astronomer and a physicist who used to oversee the observatory in Marseille, France. He's now leading a fantastic art science technology project and series of initiatives at UT Dallas. He's collecting syllabi and collaborative projects, and they're creating an enormous archive that will be available to people. So I think that there are these different groups that are interested in sort of finally really creating a kind of comprehensive repository of information. Leonardo Journal has done it throughout the years, but again, it's not like you can click, you know, that you can go to one place.
Yeah, but he was integrated within himself. He was both.
He was both, but I'm saying Leonardo Journal, which was the Leonardo group, which was initiated by Frank Molina, and his son Roger Molina now runs that group. And then there's the Leonardo Education and Art Forum, that's an arm of that. I used to be the chair of that organization, and there are panels and business meetings at the College Art Association every year run by Leonardo. So if you're interested in this territory, just ask for my contact information from Leah, and I'm happy to connect you to those people. But I think there is a growing movement. I think everybody's very frustrated that it feels still so nebulous in terms of the documentation. And the articulation of what it is to be in a lab. But there are a lot of artists in labs now. School of Visual Arts has an Artist in Labs program. And a lot of the artists that I've covered today were also working in labs. And often that's not a program, that's two people having something in common, and then the artist is invited in as the inaugural resident. So, yeah, there's lots of work to be done. Yes?
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
But particularly, I recently read Gazinga's article about the split brain patient for one of my classes.
Oh, great.
So really excited to hear that here.
And thank you for pronouncing his name correctly, which I seem to not be able to do. Thank you. Yeah.
But one of the important parts of the paper was this idea of an interpreter, where in the split patient, what not only is the corpus at the center is cut, but it was also the idea that the two halves couldn't communicate, so there's this, that couldn't get to the interpreter, which is in the left hemisphere.
Right.
And it just made me think about this kind of idea of art as an interpreter between the audience and the lay people.
That's a great analogy. You should write something on that and contact Leonardo and see if you can publish it. That's a really nice analogy. And it's through those analogies, and I think through metaphors, that we often come to understand, you know, the other, you know, whether it's science to art or art to science. But you're absolutely right. And that slide that I showed of the meeting, the art-science meeting, the woman in the green sweater, Lizzie Schechter, is studying just that, the inability of the left and the right hemispheres for people who have that severed corpus callosum. Those two halves of the brain don't know about each other. They're strangers to one another. And oftentimes, if the person's asked, why did you do that, the brain struggles to come up with an explanation. It's very interesting research that the two halves of the brain they're not aware of the other.
The role of the story, you also mentioned, just like the role of the story, but that's the interpreter creates the story, creates the reasoning, and I really see a connection there with how art is creating a story for our understanding of our cosmos.
Run with that. That's a good way to begin a grant application or a conversation with a scientist. Really good. Great. Last questions? Comments? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been enjoying this class because I approach things primarily from a scientific perspective, not from an artistic perspective. And so you had a phrase when you were talking earlier. You said the human side of science.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of my perception of science is, or of the why this class is important is because you need to have this interpretation of science, but the science should not necessarily be humanistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you would expand on how you sort of see this as someone who sort of straddles this border very well.
Well, that's a big question because there's the way that the humanistic gets worked out sort of in the laboratory where you're shadowing a scientist and then you're sort of interpreting what's happening in the lab and taking it outward. But then, as I was saying to Jan Henrik, it's also that the artist can be the interpreter of the science to the broader public. And it's through that interpretation that we actually understand the significance to the larger social order, right? So it's that connection to the social that's always so interesting and so critical. And deeply political, of course, right? I mean, if you think strictly, I mean, two examples. The power of the visual, right? We learned new ways to image the human fetus. And so we had these magnificent images of fetuses at a very, very young age. And it completely changed the way that people debated abortion rights, right? Because you see this thing that looks like a human at a very young age, and it changes how you feel about human life, personhood, individuality, whether or not this being has a vested interest in its own well-being, all of these things that are so important to this kind of debate, right? And so it's not just a visualization of something, it's what that visualization means to the larger social order of things. What happened when BP spilled all that oil, right? As soon as we couldn't see it, we were convinced it wasn't there. Right? So this is the way the power of the visual starts to come in a very social way. Of course, smart scientists were saying, no, it's still here.